All right, let's dive into one of the biggest questions out there. This is a topic that has tied philosophers and scientists in knots for centuries. We're talking about the ultimate mystery, the one that's happening inside your head right now. We're talking about consciousness.
If you ask a bunch of scientists what the single hardest problem is, a lot of them will tell you it's understanding our own subjective experience. It's consciousness itself. How does the wet, electrical fizzing happening between your ears produce the feeling of seeing the color red, or the taste of chocolate, or the simple, undeniable sense that you are you listening to my voice right now?
The word itself actually comes from Latin, meaning to know with another. And that's pretty wild when you think about it, because right now the scientific community is, well, it's far from sharing a single definition. In fact, that original Latin can also mean sharing knowledge with oneself, which is just a perfect way to frame the debate researchers are having today.
So here's our game plan. We're going to map out the current landscape of this huge scientific debate. We'll start with the problem itself, and then we'll look at the major competing ideas. Is consciousness a global broadcast in the brain? Is it a kind of reflection of ourselves, a unified world model? Or is it something weirder, something balanced on the very edge of chaos?
Okay, so before we get into all the different theories, we really need to get a handle on the central problem everyone is trying to solve. And to even begin to tackle this beast, scientists have very cleverly split the question in two.
So you've got what's called the hard problem. This is the huge philosophical why question. Why do we have any inner experience at all? Why isn't it all just dark inside? But for now, most neuroscientists are focused on what they call the real problem. That's the how. How do specific neurons firing in a specific pattern create the very specific feeling of seeing a dog versus, say, a cat? And that's where the big fights really begin.
Let's kick things off with two of the heavyweight champions in the field, and they offer totally different views on what it actually takes for a piece of information to become part of your conscious experience.
So the first big idea is called the Global Neuronal Workspace Theory, or GNWT. Think of it like this. For you to be conscious of something, that piece of information has to win a competition in your brain. It gets amplified and then broadcast across this global workspace, making it available to everything, your memory, your language, your motor control. It basically has to achieve, as some scientists put it, fame in the brain.
But then you've got recurrent processing theory, which says, hold on a minute. It argues you don't need that global fame at all. The super rich feedback of information that's happening locally, these little recurrent loops just buzzing within your visual cortex, for example, that's enough to create a conscious experience. The idea here is you can actually see way more than you can ever report.
So what's the big fight here? It really boils down to this. Is consciousness all about widespread access and your ability to talk about something, like GNW says? Or is it a much richer, more local thing that can happen even without your focused attention, like RPT suggests?
Okay, but what if there's another layer to all this? What if consciousness isn't just about the experience itself, but about our knowledge that we're having an experience?
This is where higher-order theories come in. They basically propose a two-step process. So, step one, your brain has a perception. It processes the color red. But here's the catch. According to this theory, that's not conscious yet. Consciousness happens in step two, when another part of your brain generates a thought about that perception. So the consciousness isn't the seeing, it's the knowing that you are seeing.
Now, a really fascinating version of this idea is called attention schema theory. It suggests that our feeling of awareness is actually a useful but super simplified self-caricature. Your brain builds a little model of its own attention process so it can control it better, and what we experience as that feeling of being consciously aware is just that model in action.
So you've got all these theories kind of duking it out. It's a bit messy, right? Well, naturally, some researchers are now trying to build a bridge, a unified theory that can bring all these different perspectives together.
IWMT is kind of like the diplomat in the room. It suggests that consciousness is the subjective experience of an agent, that's you, actively building a coherent, predictive model of the world and of itself within that world. It's not just about processing information. It's about what that information is for, helping you navigate reality.
So how does the brain actually do this? Well, one key mechanism might be something called SOMs. The best way to think about these is like large-scale brainwaves that create these temporary communication channels. It's like a synchronized orchestra, allowing all the different distant parts of the brain to coordinate and share information to build that one unified model of the world.
And how does the brain build this clean model from a constant storm of noisy, messy sensory data? Well, this theory borrows a really cool concept from communication engineering called turbocoding. It's basically a process where you pass information back and forth, over and over, correcting errors each time until a single, clear, reliable signal emerges. This could be how our brain turns chaos into the clear, continuous stream we call reality.
All right, this brings us to some of the most profound and maybe a little mind-bending ideas about the actual structure of our minds. What if the patterns of consciousness are more fundamental, more like a law of nature than we think?
Some theories suggest our minds are basically structured like stories. We don't just process facts, we weave them into a narrative to make sense of everything. And this story might use fractal patterns, where the same basic shape repeats at different scales, and recursion, which is really just thoughts about thoughts. And who's the main character in this internal story? Well, that's our sense of self.
For all this to work, the brain might need to operate in a kind of sweet spot, also known as the edge of chaos. See, if the brain is too orderly, it's rigid, it can't adapt. If it's too chaotic, nothing makes sense. But right there, at that critical point in between, information processing is maximized. It allows for the complex, flexible, and dynamic nature of thought. And a perspective like this starts to demystify things we often think of as magical, like intuition, that gut feeling or that sudden aha moment. It isn't some message from beyond. It's your brain being an incredibly fast pattern matching machine, rapidly reconfiguring the connections between all the stuff you already know. It's the moment a new, more elegant pattern just clicks into place. So all of this leaves us with a really provocative thought. If consciousness isn't some special magical substance, but instead it's an emergent property of complex self-organizing systems, well, that forces us to ask a pretty profound question that pushes the boundaries of how we see ourselves and maybe even our place in the entire cosmos.